An 85-year-old widow who secretly saved a child for 40 years. For most people in the town, Margaret Ellis was just another old widow. She was 85 years old, walked slowly with a wooden cane, and lived alone in a small, quiet house at the edge of the city. People often saw her feeding birds in the park or buying only bread and milk from the local store. No one knew her story, and no one imagined that for 40 years she had been protecting a secret that could change someone's life forever. A quiet life after tragedy. Margaret had not always been alone. 45 years ago, she was happily married to her husband, Thomas, a schoolteacher with a kind heart. They tried for years to have children, but fate was cruel. They never became parents. Then one winter night, everything changed. Thomas died suddenly in a road accident. Margaret's world collapsed. From that day on, she became silent, withdrawn, and painfully lonely. But destiny was about to knock on her door in the most unexpected way. The night she found the child. One rainy evening, almost 40 years ago, Margaret heard a soft sound outside her house. It was not thunder, not the wind, it was crying. She opened the door and froze. There, on her doorstep, was a tiny baby wrapped in a thin, wet blanket. The child was shivering, barely breathing, with a small note pinned to his clothes. Her hands trembled as she read the note. "Please save my child. I have no choice. Forgive me." No name, no explanation, just fear and desperation. A decision that changed everything. Margaret could have called the police. She could have taken the baby to an orphanage. But when the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, something inside her broke. For the first time since her husband's death, her empty house felt alive. She whispered softly, "I will protect you." And from that moment, Margaret made a decision that would define the next 40 years of her life. Raising a child in secret. Margaret named the baby Daniel. She raised him as her own, but with one strict rule: no questions about his past. In official records, Daniel was listed as a distant relative. Margaret lived carefully, quietly, never drawing attention. She worked small jobs, saved every penny, and gave Daniel everything she could: education, discipline, and most importantly, love. Daniel grew up believing Margaret was simply his guardian, not his real mother, and Margaret never corrected him. The pain of silence. Every year on Daniel's birthday, Margaret would lock herself in her room and cry. She wrote letters she never sent. She kept the original note hidden in a small wooden box under her bed. She feared one thing more than death itself: that Daniel would find out the truth and leave her. So she stayed silent for 40 long years. Daniel's success. Daniel grew up into a brilliant, hard-working man. He became a successful engineer, moved to another city, and built a life of his own. But no matter how busy he was, he never forgot Margaret. He called her every week. He visited her every year. Still, he felt something was missing. Margaret, now weak and frail, sensed her time was running out, and she knew the truth could no longer stay hidden. The final confession. On Margaret's 85th birthday, Daniel came to see her. She looked smaller than ever, her voice barely a whisper. She asked him to sit beside her bed. "Daniel," she said softly, "before I leave this world, there is something you must know." She handed him the old wooden box. Inside was the faded note, and adoption papers, and letters written over decades, all addressed to him. Daniel's hands shook as he read. Tears fell onto the paper. The truth revealed. Margaret spoke slowly, fighting her tears. "You were left at my door as a baby. I was never your biological mother, but I loved you like one." Daniel broke down completely. He held her hands tightly and cried, "You saved my life. You are my mother." Margaret smiled for years. Her secret was finally free. After her death, Margaret passed away peacefully 2 weeks later. At her funeral, Daniel stood silently, holding the small wooden box. Later, he discovered something else. Margaret had left everything to him. Not money, but a message. "Saving you saved me." A legacy of love. Daniel later founded a charity for abandoned children, naming it Margaret's Doorstep. He made sure no child would ever feel unwanted again, because one old widow, one quiet decision, had saved a life for 40 years. Ending line, perfect for YouTube. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they are just old women with broken hearts who choose love over fear. In a quiet town where people rarely noticed anything beyond their own lives, lived an old widow named Margaret Ellis. At 85 years old, Margaret's world was small. A narrow street, a tiny house with peeling paint, and memories that refused to fade. People saw her every morning, slowly sweeping her porch. Every evening, she sat near the window, watching the sun disappear. To the world, she was invisible. But for one man, she was everything. Before the silence. Margaret had once lived a life full of laughter. She married Thomas Ellis when she was just 25. He was a school teacher, gentle, patient, and endlessly kind. They dreamed of a noisy house filled with children's laughter. But year after year, the house stayed silent. Doctors had no answers. Hope slowly turned into acceptance. Still, Margaret and Thomas were happy until fate showed no mercy. The night that changed her forever. One cold winter evening, Thomas never came home. A speeding truck, a sudden crash, a life ended in seconds. Margaret identified his body alone. From that day, the woman who loved talking stopped speaking. The woman who smiled stopped smiling. She lived, but only in name. A cry in the rain. Almost 5 years later, on a stormy night, Margaret was awakened by a sound, a weak cry, barely audible. She opened the door. On her doorstep lay a newborn baby, soaked from the rain, lips turning blue. Margaret screamed for help, but the street was empty. Pinned to the baby's blanket was a note. "I can't keep him alive. Please, you are his only hope." Margaret looked at the child. For the first time in years, her heart beat fast. A risky choice. Calling the police would have been easy. Handing the baby to authorities would have been right. But Margaret remembered her empty arms, her quiet house. She closed the door. That night, she fed the baby warm milk with shaking hands and whispered, "You're safe now." She named him Daniel. God is my judge. Living in fear. Raising Daniel was not easy. Margaret lived in constant fear of discovery. She avoided hospitals. She avoided questions. She told neighbors Daniel was her late cousin's child. Every knock on the door terrified her. But Daniel grew. Healthy, curious, bright. And Margaret learned to smile again. A mother without the title. Margaret never called herself his mother. She corrected him gently when he once asked, "I'm just the one who looks after you." But every night she watched him sleep, praying, "Let me live long enough to protect him." The price of love. Margaret worked endlessly. She skipped meals so Daniel could eat better. She wore old clothes so he could go to school properly dressed. When Daniel asked why she never bought anything for herself, she said, "I have everything I need." That was a lie. What she needed was time. Growing apart. Daniel grew into a strong, intelligent man. He left for college, then for work. Margaret waved goodbye with a smile and cried for hours after he left. Her house became silent again, but this time it had memories. The truth she couldn't carry anymore. As Margaret's health failed, guilt grew heavier than fear. She wondered, does he deserve the truth? Every night she read the old note. Every night she delayed, until her 85th birthday. The confession. Daniel sat beside her hospital bed. Margaret handed him a box. Inside, the note, legal papers, 40 years of unsent letters. Her voice trembled. "I didn't give birth to you, but I chose you." Daniel collapsed in tears. "You didn't save me. You gave me a life." Her final piece. Margaret died holding Daniel's hand. No fear, no regrets, just peace. What she left behind. Daniel later learned she left him nothing material, only one sentence in her will. Love is not about blood, it's about choice. A promise kept. Daniel kept her promise alive. He opened shelters for abandoned children. Every door painted the same color as Margaret's old house, and on each door a sign. Everyone deserves to be chosen. Powerful ending line. Sometimes the strongest love comes from the weakest hands, and sometimes an old widow saves the world, one child at a time.